assuming we've unzipped the SDK, it will look like this for you, where you have a handful of projects, C#, C++, and so on, the FinalBots project, and the test client. We're going to step in the test client folder, and in here we have two executables, one for Mono and one for .NET. If you're running on Mono, you simply type Mono, or either you right-click this and you choose to run it with Mono, or you can go from the command line, choose Mono, and then the path to this exe. If you're running on .NET, you're probably on Windows, and you can just double-click this file. This is the current version of the SDK test client, and there's only a few different options you have. The first thing you can do is you can run a new matchup. Now, if you run a new matchup, it'll ask you for some basic settings. How many players you want. The default is 5, but you can go from 2 to 10. Whether or not you want to disable the bot timeout. Now, this is key. If you're running and you're attached to a debugger, you should definitely disable the bot timeout, just because when you pause inside the debugging session, all that time is still being counted against your bot, and so it will time out on its next turn if you don't have this checked. Another option you have is to save a log of the matchup, and that's useful and on by default. And then finally, you can pause after each hand if you want to. And what this will simply do is at the end of each hand, it will give you a continue button to choose. So we'll just run it with the defaults here. Now, the next step will ask you to select one player for each option you chose earlier. So we chose 5, so it'll ask us to go from the bots that it found in the system that's configured right now, 5 players to run against each other. Now, we can also select a human. So if you select a human, it'll ask you for the move at every turn. So you'll get an interface that's pretty similar to the virtual interface that your bot sees on its API, except that you'll be able to manually select whether you want to call or raise and so forth. Now, another neat feature of this is there is a manage bot locations, and by default the bots directory in here will have any bots that are in here will be detected and used. So the SDK comes with the FinalBot Hold'em SampleBots DLL already built from the other project and living in this directory. But if you want to add others, and in my case I have a project directory out here, you can go and add that and it will search that directory as well. These searches are not recursive, so it has to be explicitly in the directory that contains the DLLs. And if I hit add, then I can go into other directories if I wanted to and be able to do the same thing out here. Now I'm just going to use this, keep that one directory, so I'm actually going to cancel this. And in my bot, what I want to do is I'm going to use one instance of my bot, so I'll do selected bot here. And then I'm going to pick the FinalBot, and I will just have him run the second bot. I'll use CallBot for one, the FoldBot for one, and the RaiseBot. Now, as you could probably imagine, before I finish here, my bot has some basic logic in it. There's also the CallBot, which will simply call every bet, so it'll always return the minimum call amount. Now, this will ultimately force it to go all in at some point, unless it wins the tournament. But remember, the system itself is kind of smart to know that if you call the amount and it's more chips than you have, it'll just assume you're going all in. The conservative bot, or FinalBot, has some simple logic in it, but it plays fairly conservatively. It has a 20% chance of raising depending on the hand it has, and will fold if you try to raise on it and its hand isn't that good. FoldBot will simply return 0 all the time, so it'll always fold or check, which is a surprisingly effective strategy depending on who you're up against. RaiseBot will always raise. And this is another effective strategy, because if you're a bot that's a little more timid, that doesn't necessarily want to stay in without the good cards, this guy will bluff you out of existence. So when you're writing your own bot, you want to build something to submit to the system. It's nice to try it up against all 4 of these bots, because then you're getting a pretty good surface area of test. So I'm just going to hit finish here, and it's now going to run through and play a full tournament against all these different bots. And so now you can see really each one of these is the hand, and all the way down at the end, in this case the RaiseBot ultimately beats the FoldBot. But I'll walk through some of the earlier hands to kind of give you an idea of how this works. So the way this is laid out is the first thing it's going to tell you is the game number, what the community cards were for that game, and what the total pot was. This actually does not break down into the split pots or side pots or anything like that. It just tells you the total pot number, just to give you a scale of how important that given hand was from a chip perspective. It'll also give you information about the private cards for each bot for that hand, and what its best hand was. So in the case of this game, I had a queen and a 9. That was a pair of queens, ultimately, because we had a queen here on the turn. And I would say if we went down, my bot ended up folding later on. And if you look at the behavior of the specific bots in here, the fold bot always returned 0, which means that it didn't even call the initial blinds, and it automatically folded. The call bot, not surprisingly, called, and the raise bot raised. One slight distinction to note here is the numbers that follow all of these things are the number of chips that were wagered. It doesn't. So when you see raise 2, it didn't actually raise 2. This really means that the return was 2, and that was a raise. And this is important because a lot of times when you're debugging, you really just want to see the number of chips that were returned here, and you can pretty easily analyze it by eye. That here, when it says raise 4, there really was a call of 2, and then it raised another 2. And you could do that manually, but when you're running through this very quickly, trying to analyze it as a developer, you want to see what was the number that my bot returned in this case. And as we go down the line, we can see the raise bot continue to raise every hand. Some of the bots folded. For example, ConservaBot, FoldBot, and EdBot will have folding behavior. CallBot will never fold, and RaiseBot will never fold, just because of the fact they're so hard-coded. And you can see that the different behavior that goes on here, my bot would not perform well against, really against the fold bot. But what I always like to do is to kind of look down at some of the larger hands and figure out what's the performance and how well does my bot do in larger hands, and does it wager a lot and do raises and calls and then fold for some reason, because that's an important thing to understand when you're designing a bot, so that you can understand what ways to improve it. Now, another useful feature here is there's load log. Now, since I saved the log, it actually provided that here. So I would be able to navigate to this XML file. And there's also something called FBHE files, which stands for FinalBot Hold'em. And that's really just this XML file that's been zipped up and changed and had its extension changed. And that's the format that we use when we store these out in the FinalBot cloud, because we want to minimize the amount of space. So if you just take a look, this is, for example, 203 and 109 kilobytes. Because it's XML, we can compress it down to 2 or 3 kilobytes. So if you have the XML files or the FBHE files, you'll be able to open any of those here. And if I just double click to open that, it'll actually just load the game we were looking at. But this is kind of cool, because if you want to go back and look at past performance and see how your bot changes behavior over time, that's useful to know. Another nice feature is rematch. So if I had my IDE open and I was building my bot, I might add in a little behavior, just change the functionality a little bit, and hit the rematch button, and it'll run through the last matchup that it had, and it'll use the same exact opponents and have that same behavior. And that's a very useful thing to have, because sometimes you want to get the broad strokes in place with your bot before you go in and really debug the details as to how to optimize some of that behavior. Now, another thing I want to touch on here for new matchup is if we go in, I'm actually going to select this time. I'm going to go up against, I'm going to pick 4 of my own bot, and then I'm going to choose a human. And this is the behavior with humans. So you'll see it started off, and I'm the 3rd bot in line here, or rather the 4th bot in line. So we had 4 bots already went. There was the small blind, big blind, 1 bot folded, 1 bot called. And I have the option here as a human player to determine how I want to participate. So I can say, well, I've got a 10 of spades and a jack of hearts, so I'm going to go all in. And then at that point I go all in. Fortunately for me, I ended up doing pretty well in that with 3 of a kind 10, and a few of these lemming bots just followed me over the cliff, and one of them intelligently folded. And so now I can continue the game and keep going all in, probably until I lose or until I run out of luck. And in this case, it's going to continue. And since I'm out of it, these guys are just going to play against each other, and you can see all the different performance throughout the rest of the game until somebody ultimately wins, which is probably not too far down the road. As I click through, and we can see it actually took 42 games, because it got to a point where the small blind was 16 and large blind was 32. But that's a quick path through what that experience is like. And one other thing I want to bring into focus is the FinalBot.com website. And if I click through to my bot from the home page, or any of the bots, or I can navigate to it from my bot and so on, I'll have the option to actually navigate through and see all the different performance of the various tournaments I was in, and I could see I came in third in the daily ranking tournament today. And so if I click through that, I could see who performed the best, the different games that are involved. We have a small pool of early users now, so it's only one actual matchup in this tournament. But I can click download, and what that will do is it'll give me the option, and I've already registered this FBHE extension with that SDK project. So if I just click to open, it'll actually go ahead and open that in here for me directly, and I can now look to see how I performed against all the other bots that were in the system. And of course, I might need to go back after this third place finish and figure out what could I do a little better against some of these other bots' behaviors. And that's how you can get started with FinalBot Hold'em. If you've got any questions, please let us know over here in the FinalBot forums.